In July 1966, the Italian national team arrived at the airport in Rome. They were greeted not with cheers, not with jubilation, but with fruit and rotten tomatoes. Halfway around the world, the architect or the man who claimed uh, credit for or took the credit for this Italian team's downfall wrote, "In order to be a good footballer, you must run swiftly and pass the ball accurately." Wise words. Uh, but what makes it interesting are these words did not come from a manager, uh, but rather from one Kim Il-sung, General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea and the eternal leader of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. Uh, Welcome back, friends. It's Professor Matt, and this is the Too Many Guys Soccer Show history. And this is part two of a sort of series within a series about, aspects of decolonization and the 1966 World Cup. And today we're going to be talking about Juche ball, Cholima ball, right? And the journey of North Korea in 1966 and the diplomatic chaos that that created. And also to the importance of this North Korean team, right? Because when we think of North Korea, we don't necessarily think of international football. I know their women's team is quite good apparently now, but to be totally honest, I mean, the men's side has only participated in two World Cups. For me and most of us, probably listening or watching the pod, we remember, 2010, where they put up a spirited performance in their opener against Brazil, but then got absolutely smashed by Ronaldo and company, I think 7-0 to Portugal. But the 1966 team, the debut team, uh, is incredibly important in so much that they were the first non-European or South American squad to advance out of the group stage in the World Cup. So, yeah, North Korea, weirdly enough, has that distinction, which means there's a, place in history for them. And we'll talk more about this. I alluded to, the Italians. They slay a couple giants in doing so. So join me as we talk about uh, the magical summer of 1966 and one of the sort of sub stories or subplots that doesn't really get talked about, but probably should. Uh, so North Korea or Korea in general, right? I mean, let's begin at the beginning. The beautiful game gets to Korea during the colonial period when Korea, when it was still united, was a colony of Japan. So in the decades sort of after World War One, right? And Koreans participate in international tournaments as members of the Japanese team. The Japanese team that goes to Berlin in 1936 for the Olympics actually had six Koreans on them, but they couldn't be classified as Koreans, right? Because, Korea was technically administered as part of not just the Japanese overseas empire, but of Japan itself. Uh, the Korean Peninsula, however, is divided in the wake of World War II. Right, the Soviet Union, which had signed a non-aggression pact with the Japanese in 1941, enters the war in the Pacific in the last month of the war, so like right before we drop the bomb. And they pretty much blitz the Red Army blitzkriegs through northern China, so Manchuria, and into the Korean Peninsula. But before the Soviets had agreed to enter the war against Japan, they had spoke with the Western Allies, the United States, and they had agreed upon that after the war, the Korean Peninsula would be split, a la Germany, into two occupation zones. The Soviets would occupy the northern part of the country, and the United States would occupy the southern part of the country. Uh, and that was the situation until about 1948. And if you recall last summer when, I did this series connected to the Euros, the episode on the two Germanys, the situation in Korea is sort of eerily similar to the situation in Germany. The Allies agree upon these different occupation zones, but outside of that, they don't really agree on anything. There's no actual plan. And so by the time you get to 1948, both the United States and the Soviet Union effectively rebuild or reconstruct their Koreas in their own images. And indeed, by the end of 1948, there are two separate Korean governments: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, which is set up along Soviet lines, right, and South Korea, the Republic of Korea, which is sort of vaguely a democracy, but in many ways, more about this in a bit, is sort of at least in its first couple decades of existence, sort of a carryover of the Japanese colonial regime, right? Because the people that the United States puts in charge of South Korea, with the exception of Syngman Rhee, the first president, who is a college professor who no one in Korea frick knew about. Right? Kind of like that dude that we tried to install as president of Iraq after, George Bush's misadventures in 2003. Most of the people in charge in the South are former Japanese collaborators. And right in 1950, you have the Korean War, which lasts till 1953, and it ends, and this is important, not with a peace treaty, because technically the Korean War is still going on. All the Korean War ended with an armistice, effectively a broad ceasefire, and right, no formal peace treaty was ever signed. So technically, the United States, Britain, South Korea, certainly, are all technically still at war. With the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which might explain, why the North Koreans sort of act the way they do. So, a North Korean football team and league pyramid doesn't get started until after the Korean War. In 1954, they applied to join the Asian Football Federation, so AFC. And right in 1955, they apply and get to join FIFA. And right, they set up their own domestic league, again, much like East Germany, along Soviet standards, right? There are Dynamo, there's an army club, there's a secret police club, there's a railroad club, etc. Uh, but the thing is, the North Koreans, even though they have a national team as early as 1954, they don't play their first actual competitive match until the 1st of March 1964 against Burma. So wait a minute. That's a 10-year gap between the establishment of the national team, 9 years after they officially joined FIFA, 10, after they're formally recognized as a member of the Asian Confederation. What took so goddamn long? Right. Well, there's a reason for this. Outside of the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and right, the people's democracies in Eastern Europe and Mongolia, no one really in the world recognizes North Korea's existence. And indeed, most of the pro-Western states, not just in the West, but also in the decolonizing world, right? Because we forget, the Korean War, is the United States, obviously, but it was Britain, but it was also countries like Ethiopia, right? They sent troops, etc. So, like, the vast majority of the planet doesn't recognize North Korea's right to exist, nor do they recognize, excuse me, they're still technically at war with. So you don't play friendlies with a country you're at war at or you don't recognize, and you sure as hell don't invite them to international tournaments, right? So the North Koreans are sort of victims of their own sort of, place in the international community after the Korean War. And, this is an issue. Now, before we talk about how the North Koreans get to play Burma in 1964 and how ultimately they get to enter the World Cup in 1966, we have to talk a little bit about the place of football and of sport in general in North Korea. So there's a little bit of, background history here. Right. Football, as we've talked about, particularly in the series I did on fascism last year, football always serves as an ideological showpiece to any regime, but particularly authoritarian or totalitarian ones like North Korea was and still is. Right. The better you do at football, the more legitimacy the regime is going to have, right? And North Korea in the particularly the second half of the 50s and 1960s, the two big centerpieces uh are development, more about that in a second, and legitimacy, right? Because again, outside of the socialist bloc, no one talks to them, no one recognizes them. So football obviously is going to be a vehicle to achieve these kinds of things. And right, beginning in the mid 50s, the North Koreans start to kind of go about things their own way, kind of a la, going back to a really early Too Many Guys soccer history episode, much like Yugoslavia, but very different, right? Yugoslavia breaks with the Soviet Union in the late 40s. Under Tito, you have this really genuinely liberal kind of socialist state. The North Koreans, they never really break with the Soviets, but they effectively do after 1956. And unlike Yugoslavia, that goes down a relatively liberal path, the North Koreans doubled down on the Stalinism. Why do I say 1956? Well, that is the year that Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev goes before the 20th Party Congress of the uh, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, 3 years after Papa Joe Stalin croaks, and gives a speech that's supposedly secret, but it's not, where he says, look, the last 20 years, effectively, we've been fucking up. We fucked up. Right, Stalin was wrong, and we are going to go back to the Marxism of Marx, the Marxism of Lenin, and, the humanistic side of Marxism. North Korea, as indeed some other states, China, right, they weren't all that pleased with this. Albania certainly wasn't. They take the secret speech in 56 and they do kind of the opposite approach. Rather than following the Soviet example and liberalizing, they use the secret speech as a way to challenge Soviet hegemony, right? And say, look, even though the Soviet Union is the cradle of international socialism and the international working class, uh, because we now know that Stalin was wrong, that means that, you can't speak for all of us, and we have our own sort of separate paths to socialism, right? And also, too, as a way to kind of strengthen their own regimes to actually, as again, unlike Yugoslavia where you have this liberalization, or Poland where after 56 you get really genuinely about 15 years or so of genuine sort of liberal socialist rule. These states like North Korea and Albania, they double down on the Stalinism. They say, okay, well, the Soviet Union can't dictate to us exactly what ideological orthodoxy looks like, so we're going to go our own way. And, rather than following your lead, we're going to do the exact goddamn opposite. And so, right, after 1956 and up to about 1960, there are these purges in North Korea where, Kim Il-sung, who was a partisan, He spent some time in the Soviet Union during World War II, but he was a anti-Japanese partisan fighter in the 1930s. He and his, followers pretty much weed out the North Korean leaders, the party elite, which had, mainly been active in the Soviet Union. Right. And the fact that you have a Sino-Soviet Cold War, right, because there's this challenge between China and the Soviet Union after the secret speech about who should lead the socialist world. Right. The North Koreans use that to their advantage too, and they sort of side a little bit with the Chinese, but they never totally side with the Chinese either, because they also use this opportunity to weed out the pro-Chinese faction within the Workers' Party of Korea. So effectively, by 1960, all of Kim Il-sung's, domestic rivals are either sort of in exile as ambassadors to like Mongolia or something, or they're freaking dead. Uh, and the North Korean regime becomes, in a very real way, a sort of uniquely domestic socialist regime, modeled off of the Soviet model, but being led by Korean communists who had fought the Japanese and had primarily operated in Korea during the revolutionary period. Right. And also who are committed increasingly to a different sort of quote unquote national brand of Marxist-Leninism, uh, which is going to be buttressed on something they called juche or self-reliance. Right, they were going to construct socialism in Korea with Korean factors and Korean conditions in mind. And they were not going to kowtow to the Soviet Union, who after 1956 cannot claim hegemony over the socialist bloc, and also not China either, right? Because even though the North Koreans kind of side with the Chinese in the Sino-Soviet rift, they do so partially out of gratitude because the Chinese effectively saved their ass during the Korean War. But also, too, very pragmatically, so that they can get out of the Soviet orbit and don't become just, another Czechoslovakia or Bulgaria or something. Uh so there's this new ideological formulation called Juche, self-reliance from the Soviet Union, but also the Chinese. Things get bad after the events I talk about today in regards to the Chinese. During the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guard goes up to North Korea, and they say stuff, and they tell Kim Il Sung, "Oh, you're too fat to be a communist, and you live in a big nice house," and Kim Il Sung's just like, "Get the fuck out of my country, leave, go leave." So, self-reliance, juche, go, we don't like to be talked to. And again, think about it this way. This is about decolonization. Korea, historically, even before the Japanese showed up, is a small country which has always been dominated by its larger neighbors. So the fact that a North Korean brand of state socialism would be really nationalistic, really paranoid, not really all that interested in listening to its immediate neighbors or allowing itself to be dominated by its immediate neighbors, including its supposed allies in the Soviet Union and China, that makes so much sense. It makes total sense. Right. So Juche becomes, self-reliance becomes the model. And right, it becomes a model for the North Koreans increasingly in the 1960s, and particularly in the 70s and the 80s, a model for potential export, because the North Koreans can sell their model of socialism and their model of development to other decolonizing states around the world, because they could say, okay, we did this and we did it our own way. We didn't do it like the Soviets, we didn't do it like the Chinese, and we, as a country emerging out of imperialism, emerging out of colonization, our model may make the most sense to you in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia or South Asia, etc. Uh, Another aspect of this too is so you have Juche, self-reliance on the one hand. The other is something called Kolima, which incidentally is the nickname of the North Korean football team. Now, what is Kolima? Well, Kolima is a mythical Chinese flying horse that entered Korean but also Japanese mythology, back in the medieval period. But in the North Korean context, Kolima is short for speed. And in this case, it's speed uh, in terms of fast economic growth. So industrialization, state-driven industrialization, modernization, and speed in terms of the path to communism. And right, Kolima comes into the North Korean ideological lexicon roughly around the same time Juche comes in. So like late 50s, early 60s, and definitely by the mid 60s, it both of these things are enshrined in North Korea's ideological formation, right? To the point that as the 1960s and 70s moves on, you see in documents the term Marxist-Leninism being used less and less by the North Korean leadership, and Juche and Kolima being used more and more frequently, because these are like the domestic brands of this, right? Because even though they were Marxists, Marx was still not Korean. Marx was a white dude. So, and we're doing this the Korean way. So Kolima meant sort of, industrialization and the pathway to communism on speed. It's the bullet train to socialism, to development, etc. And again, that becomes the name, that's the nickname to this day of the North Korean national football team. In fact, sometimes you see the North Koreans, their kits tend to be very simple, right? Because they're homemade, because juche tax. But every now and again, you see on the kit this flying horse, the speed. And so by the mid 60s, so by the time we're talking about the 66 World Cup and the lead up to it, the North Koreans have kind of gone their own way. I mean, they're a socialist country, they're still part of the socialist bloc, but they're not East Germany, they're not Poland, and they're not even outliers like Yugoslavia, where you can get Western goods and watch Western movies. This is a closed Stalinistic society uh that's chosen and embraced its own unique brand of state socialism, and increasingly, right, because the Korean War, a lot of the world's still at war with them, they're not a member of the international community other than the socialist bloc. Increasingly they're starting to assert themselves on the global stage. And, they're doing this by saying, look, Juche, Kolima, for the decolonizing world, these are, you know, ways in which you can develop and you can modernize and you can gain full independence. You can break the chains of, neo-imperialism, right? And also go about your own path to modernity, not being dictated by, the imperialist West, but not by the Soviet Union or the Chinese either. So, right, there's these moves to get recognition, and indeed, beginning in the early 60s, certain quote unquote progressive regimes in the third world, the decolonizing world, in the Arab world, for example, start recognizing North Korea, ditto Sub-Saharan Africa, etc. And right, they're not members of the UN yet, but they're starting to make inroads there, and they're definitely starting to make inroads in the non-aligned movement, the NAM, which makes sense because if you think about what the North Koreans have embraced, this path they've embraced, even though they're a socialist country, much like, weirdly enough, like Yugoslavia, which took the opposite approach in a lot of ways, they're a non-aligned socialist country, right? They're not part of the Warsaw Pact. Uh, they don't, they kind of tilt a little pro-Chinese during the Sino-Soviet rift, but they're not on either team. They fit very nicely with states like India, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Indonesia, etc. This block of non-aligned countries. And football, international football, is a means to gain global visibility, but also to potentially export your particularly ideological brand, right? Because it's not just, exporting the idea of Juche, the idea of Kolima, it's exporting the particular brand of football that is birthed by Juche and Kolima, right? And, the fact is, we're going to see the fact that North Korea becomes the first non-European, non-South American country and the first explicitly post-colonial country to get out of the group stage of the World Cup is going to be used because other countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America look at what the North Koreans do and they say, shit, how did they do that? I want to do that. Maybe we should talk to them and figure out how they did that, and we can borrow some ideas. So, North Korea, who is just not in the global framework, right? Not in the community of nations, uh, right? And who hasn't bothered qualifying for any tournaments before this, in the lead up to the 1966 World Cup, say, okay, we're going to enter the race. There's enough countries in the Asian Football Federation that recognize our existence. Not everybody, more about that in a second. But there's enough where we can actually like play people, and the fact that we're there is not going to really piss too many people off, but it does. Right. And we think we have a shot. And they actually do have a pretty good shot because, like we said in the last episode, remember, there's only one spot reserved for Africa, Asia, and Oceania. And Africa's sitting this one out. That's right, the African boycott. And had Africa not boycotted the 66 World Cup, North Korea probably doesn't get there. But because all of the African nations are sitting this out, it's really just Asia and Oceania. So it's a watered down field. And so there's a playoff for that one spot. There's between North Korea and Australia. It's going to be a two-leg playoff. Now, the matches were held in Pyongyang, not Pyongyang, Phnom Penh, excuse me, Cambodia. Why Cambodia? Well, Cambodia under Norodom Sihanouk, much to the United States' chagrin during the Vietnam War. More about that in a later episode of this series. Is non-aligned in the Cold War, so they enjoy good relations with their former colonial overlords, the French, but they also enjoy very cordial relations with members of the socialist bloc, in particular North Korea. Kim Il-sung and Norodom Sihanouk were friends. Sihanouk would come to North Korea and watch movies with the dear leader. He would, when he was in exile, after the CIA overthrows him. Later episode of this podcast, right? He chills in North Korea. He chills in one of Kim Il Sung's guest house, and he comes over for dinner, and him and Kim Il Sung kick back beers and watch movies. Right. So the match is held in Cambodia. Originally, it was to be held in Japan, but this is what I mean. There are still problems, and believe me, there's going to be bigger problems. Japan, North Korea's former colonial overlords, they do not recognize North Korea. at all. So North Korea playing Australia in Japan could not happen. So they had to hastily move the two-leg playoff to Cambodia, to a country that recognized both countries. Uh and this is in 1965. The Australians are heavy favorites. Not for any particular footballing reason. It's not like this was a good Australian team. But, like we had said in the last pod about the African boycott, the voices that seem to matter in the world of football in the mid 60s, white supremacist tax, right? Eurocentric or, Western centric tax. So the assumption was that, Australia, the white people, the settler state, was just going to roll over the North Koreans. That did not happen. The North Koreans, for a couple of years in preparation for this tournament, had done a really excellent job of not just building a national team through the ranks of their, domestic league pyramid, but also developing a particular brand, style, and identity of football. In an era where most of the planet was playing 4-2-2, the North Koreans were playing 4-3-3 attacking football. And right, they play Australia in these two-legged playoff, and much to the surprise of everyone, uh, the playoff ends 9-2 to North Korea on aggregate. The North Koreans absolutely spank them 6-1 in the opener, and then they lay off in the second match, which ends 3-1 to the North Koreans. They absolutely blitz the Australians, and then all of a sudden, North Korea, they're going to the World Cup. That's when the problems start. Because Great Britain, right, they're hosting the tournament, does not recognize North Korea. And technically, they're still at war with them. So what do you do? Well, to give you a sense of the panic, and it was panic, that set into the British diplomatic and sporting establishment, uh, this is a great quote. A British diplomat by the name of Derek Timmins, uh, when, asked about, North Korea and, what's going to happen uh, in the World Cup, commented that the North Koreans had thoughtlessly qualified for the 1966 World Cup, and that the Foreign Office was none too pleased about this. I want to go back to that quote. The North Koreans thoughtlessly qualified. I'm no fan of North Korea, the regime, or what have you. But I mean, you want to talk about imperialism. Okay, this random socialist country in Asia qualifies for your tournament. And because you're at war with them and you don't recognize them, you're like, well, they thoughtlessly qualified. No, 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 Mr. Timms, F you. But this is the problem that's in place here. And right, it's not just Britain that's got issues, because as soon as North Korea qualifies, the British Foreign Office starts getting phone calls. They get phone calls from the United States, because the United States is like, wait, the North Koreans, the people we fought for 3 years for nothing, they're coming to your tournament. How is this going to look? They're getting phone calls from South Korea. Hey, we're your favorite Korea. The enemy's coming to your crib. What are we going to do? And right, they're also getting phone calls, back to a previous episode, from the West Germans. Because the West Germans are looking at this and they're like, fuck, North Korea qualified. What if East Germany was to qualify? What do we do? What's going to happen? So North Korea, by thoughtlessly qualifying for the 1966 World Cup, upsets the entire apple cart, right? Because all of a sudden, not only is this one Asian team entering the colonizers' cup. It's so the wrong Asian team. It's a socialist uh, Asian team, and it's a socialist Asian team that most of the West does not recognize and is technically at a state of war with. What are you going to do? And it got so crazy that the Foreign Office initially actually asked FIFA and the English FA, hey, can we move the tournament? And FIFA was like, "What?" And the English FA was pissed because they knocked themselves out to win this tournament and bring, the showcase event to the cradle of the game itself. And they're like, "No, no, we're not moving the tournament because, the North Koreans showed up." Like that's crazy talk. So that's abandoned particularly quickly. But the British Foreign Office and the Football Association. And by the way, this episode's so cool because some of the stuff that I'm gonna be talking about now is stuff from my own research. I've actually read these Foreign Office documents, and right, the Foreign Office and the Football Association get together and try to figure out what to do. And so there's an 11 man, which is interesting. 11, right? So they pick a starting 11, right, from the uh, Foreign Office and the English FA to try to come up with solutions to this problem. And they have a year to do it, right? Because the North Koreans qualify in 65. They're early qualifiers for the tournament. They identify three main problems. The first concerned, for lack of a better term, nomenclature, right? Because how can the press and the public refer to a country that, according to Britain, didn't exist? So this first issue is solved relatively easily. Rather than calling them the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, they would just play under the name of North Korea. Easily enough solved. And the North Koreans wouldn't get bent out of shape, particularly by that. And they don't. The second is dicier. How would the ceremonial pageantry surrounding the tournament and each match, how can that incorporate North Korea, right? And, it's not just, uh, playing of anthems, etc. It's also how can royal personalities and dignitaries, the Queen, be permitted to potentially appear with the North Koreans, right? Because that's a weird photo op. Right? So the Foreign Office decided rather than attract attention to the North Koreans, to try to abandon any kind of royal or official presence at any of their three group stage matches, right? And, the national anthems, the national anthem would only in the 66 World Cup's weird like this. So the opening match, which was England Uruguay, you had both national anthems, you had God Save the Queen and whatever Uruguay's is. And then none of the other group stage matches, there were national anthems. That would be reserved again for the final. So you have this tournament where the first match, there's, national anthems played, the Queen's there. And then the rest of the tournament, there are no national anthems. The Queen isn't there, but the Queen is there, and you get national anthems again at the frickin' end. Why? Why does it look so weird? Well, it's because the freaking North Koreans show up. So there's that. And right. the other thing goes back to, again, sort of the anthems. It's the signs and symbols, right? So the FA and the Foreign Office bring in people from the Department of Education and Science, right? And, and these people had already spent, by the way, they had already spent over £1,000 to have set 16 flagpoles, one for each of the qualifying nations, installed at all of the stadiums that are going to host matches for the tournament. The Foreign Office tried to ensure that the North Korean flag would not be hoisted, even trying at one point to push for a complemented compromise in which flags would be taken down as each team was eliminated. Again, in the hope that the North Koreans, they were assuming, they wouldn't be there past the group stage. So, that's where it was like, okay, we could do national anthems and have the Queen at the final because North Korea's not going to be at the final. But, the Department of Education and Science, however, was like, no, we can't do that. And it got so bad that the South Korean ambassador to London, a fellow by the name of Hong Kong Lee, uh, shows up to, the Foreign Office, and he's pissed. And he's pissed because the North Korean flag is out there flying in Middlesbrough, where incidentally the North Koreans were going to be located. More about that in a second. Right. And so, yeah, that's a little dicier. So, like, you can't call them the Democratic Republic of Korea. They're North Korea. You can't have them taking photos with the Queen or any official personages. You can't have their national anthem being played. Right. And apparently nobody else's. And that got people not so happy either. Uh, and you can fly their flag, but the South Korean ambassador like throws a hissy fit. But the Foreign Office is able to, maneuver as much as they can. They were able to withdraw a set of commemorative stamps showing all 16 flags, so that was pulled. Right. But the display of paraphernalia of nationhood would be tolerated only temporarily and, geographically specifically. So, the North Korean flag could be in Middlesbrough, where the North Koreans were located and where they played their group stage matches, but nowhere else, right? Uh, and again, right, instead of, national anthems, you had the anthems play in the first match, in the opener, and in the final. That's it. So the North Koreans show up, and it's dicey. It's the British government and is not all that pleased with this, but they do enough to sort of, okay, we'll minimize their visibility here, which the North Koreans aren't particularly pleased about too, because they want to be visible, and they are. They're gonna be. Uh, so, you know, the tournament gets underway. Right. And the North Koreans, they're given space and training facilities. So their base camp is going to be in Middlesbrough. Uh, right. There were fears before the tournament that there could be animosity between the local population, uh, and, their Korean guests. And indeed, right, this is only a little over a decade after the Korean War, right? Uh, and if you look at a lot of the Foreign Office, reports about this, a lot of this notion that there's going to be animosity, some of it's real. again, this is an enemy nation, but a lot of it's also like chock full of racism. There's this assumption that the North Koreans will not have their own food and not this. I love this. They will not take to Yorkshire pudding. It's like, wow, what really? So it's a lot of it's crazy stuff. No, the North Koreans arrive in town in June of, 1966. But far from animosity, the local population of Middlesbrough, which again is largely working class, and so that's important in here too, because not that, the locals were, digesting the Juche idea and embracing, Kim Il-sung as their personal lord and savior of the revolution, but there was some sense of sort of ideological affinity between the local population and these North Koreans, right? Kind of, comrades, if you will. The town's mayor, who was Labor Party, a guy by the name of Jack Boothie, was presented with an embroidered picture of a crane, right? The bird, uh, but also of the steel behemoths, the iron cranes that dominated the area's dockyards. It was an opening gesture by the North Koreans to say, look, we come in peace, and look, we've done some homework about who you people are. You know, we may not eat your Yorkshire pudding, but we know that, this is an industrial working class place. We are a country that's industrializing. That's another thing, too. I should have mentioned this. In the 1960s, in the mid 60s in particular, North Korea, weirdly enough, because the Korean War destroys pretty much everything, and they're coming from literally zero. Their first couple 5-year plans, Kolima, are extremely successful. North Korea's gross national product, their industrial output, and their standard of living was quite high in the 60s compared to South Korea, which was still trapped in this weird neo-colonial sort of environment. The South Korean economic miracle is only just starting to kick off in the 1960s. It's largely an agrarian society. So when the North Koreans are talking about industrial progress here and stuff, it in the mid 60s it makes sense, right? North Korea is the more industrially advanced, the more modernized of the two Koreas. So right, they get to Middlesbrough, they give this peace offering to the local mayor, right? And the squad trains at the sports ground of IC Chemicals, which is the huge chemical plant in Middlesbrough. They were offered some, local school pitches, but the Koreans were like, does the industrial plant have a sporting facility? Because if so, we'd rather do it there. We'd rather do it, with, ordinary English proletarians. And that goes over well, right? And the plant itself employed something like 3,000 local people. So, it's not Wembley, but it's something. And indeed, the local population kind of adopts the North Koreans as their sort of second team in this tournament, right? The locals obviously are rooting for England. But the North Koreans, these guests become their sort of, second team. So we have to talk about the actual football now. Enough about the diplomacy, enough about all that. Is North Korea playing? Well, like I said, the Foreign Office, in their attempt to minimize North Korean visibility, they didn't get everything they wanted. They were able to do a lot. But, a lot of their maneuvering was predicated on the North Koreans are going to get grouped. There's no way they get out of this group. Uh, right, they'll show up, they'll lose 3 matches, and then already like in early July we'll forget they were even here. There will be a footnote. And if you look at the group they were placed in, which by the way was group 4, it would look like that was a safe bet, that the Foreign Office was in the right here. Because in that group, If you look at all four teams, the North Koreans are the clear underdogs. They're the minnows. So you have the two kind of favorites because right, this is kind of a group of death. You have two favorites. One, the Soviet Union. The Soviets had won the 1960 European Cup, so the Euros, and they were runners up to Franco Spain in 64. This Soviet squad, yo, they weren't at the peak of their powers. The Soviet team in the early 60s was a lot better than this team, but this was kind of the last gasp of that Soviet golden generation. And look, they had fucking guys, man. Lev Yashin, who arguably one of the 3 to 5 best goalkeepers of all time. There's a reason why that award's named after him. He was still in goal. Albert Shenetsov, uh, nicknamed Ivan the Terrible. Arguably one of the best defenders of his generation, played for CSKA Moscow, played right back, played center back. Uh, one of the best defenders of his era. Right. And he was dubbed Ivan the Terrible. I believe it was by I want to say Thomas Mueller, and that makes no goddamn sense. German striker from the period. The other Mueller. Yeah, Ivan the Terrible was there, and Valery Voronin, a excellent central defensive midfielder from Torpedo Moscow. The Soviet team was good, very good. They were not as progressive and as free and as offensively threatening as the Soviet teams from earlier in the decade, but the spine of that team was, rock solid. And so, right, and ultimately they finish in fourth place. They're one of the four semifinalists. So, they're one of the favorites in this tournament. Then you had Italy. Right. And 2 years later, incidentally, they do win the European Cup, the 1968 Euros. This Italian team, they're they're no joke, right? Because you know if you look at the European Cups, right, in the mid 60s, after the initial period of dominance by Franco's team, Real Madrid, it's Inter and AC Milan uh who win the European Cups during this period, right? And the core of this Italian squad is pretty much drawn from AC Milan and Inter. So, the core of this Italian team is the core of the teams that have won the last couple Champions Leagues, uh, especially uh, Sandro Rozzola, the Inter player. And then you have Chile. Chile had finished third at the 1962 World Cup, and they were runners up at the previous year, 1965's Copa de America. This was a solid Chilean team, not a great Chilean team, but a team which you would fancy should beat North Korea, who, again, no one really knows much about them. They beat Australia and they beat them soundly in that two-legged qualifying playoff. But, no one really knows much about these guys. And again, think about, again, the worldview. Oh, it's North Korea. They're going to lose, right? But then weird things happen. So the North Koreans are mystery men to damn near everybody in the tournament. They are not, however, mystery men to their first opponents in the group, which is the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was one of the few countries that not just recognized North Korea, had played their national team before, and indeed had played them in a pre-tournament tune-up friendly in Moscow just a couple months earlier in March of 66. So the Soviets, they knew what the North Koreans were bringing, right? So they were aware of their tactics, and the Soviets were also painfully aware that they had a size advantage over the North Koreans. Right. And again, think about the strengths of this Soviet team, central midfield, defense. The North Koreans get smoked in the opener on July 12th by the Soviets 3-0. And it's a beatdown. It's a beatdown in more than one way because, again, the Soviets know that they're bigger and they use that to their advantage. And again, they know what the North Koreans, they're familiar with their style of football. So they're like, okay, we can counteract this and we can rough these guys up. We can make this, a street fight and we like our odds. And so, the people in the British Foreign Office, they're smiling, they're happy because hey, it looks like the North Koreans are going to go out in the group. But then in the second game against Chile, things start to go wonky. So the Chileans are more technically gifted in some ways than the Soviets, but they're far less, muscular. They don't have that physicality, that size advantage. Right. And that kind of plays right in to this North Korean strategy, right? Because the North Koreans, they're going to press you, right? They were doing, I guess we call this Kalima pressing, right? As opposed to Gengen pressing. They were kind of Gengen pressing before Gengen pressing was cool. Uh so the Chileans scored first, but a penalty through midway during the first half. But towards the end of the match, the North Koreans start to assert themselves. They keep coming at the Chileans in waves and waves and waves and waves, and the Chileans are kind of holding on for dear life. And then Pak Sung Zin scores an equalizer, and the match ends 1-1. The Times of London, in its post-match coverage, stated, "Rarely have supporters taken to a team to their hearts as the football followers of Middlesbrough have taken to these whimsical Orientals." Okay, racism. But it captured the mood because when that goal went in, the stadium, which was largely filled with locals, right? Locals who had gotten tickets, exploded. It was like a bottle had come off a thing of soda that you had shaken repeatedly. Uh, BBC's commentator for the match remarked that the fans don't even cheer this loud for Middlesbrough. And something happens in the other match, which gives North Korea a lifeline, right? Because they got a point. The Soviet Union beats Italy 1-0 in, again, another kind of savage. I made a point to try to watch as many of these matches in prep for this as possible. I couldn't get all of them. I got two of the three, well, three of the North Korean matches, but you can watch the Italy Soviet Union match. Uh, that match is a bloodbath. It's literally just Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans just falling down and like hitting each other. Right. So all of a sudden, North Korea has a lifeline, but they're going to play Italy. So the Foreign Office is still relatively confident. It's like, okay, the Chileans, they failed the assignment, but the Italians are one of the favorites to win this tournament. They're not going to go home to this weird team from, North Korea, from Asia. And again, the heart of this Italian team is super talented, and it's coming from the Inter and Milan teams that were dominating European club football at that time. So there's no reason to expect the North Koreans are gonna, you know, pull something off, even though there's everything to play for. So the matches played, and things don't go well for the Italians from the start, right? Their captain, Bologna player Giancarlo Bellaglini, he had come into the match with an injury that he had picked up in against the Soviet Union. Ivan the Terrible's doing. Right. So maybe actually this is, socialist brotherhood in action. The Soviets, the North Koreans had the Soviets take out a hit on Italy's captain. He was struggling. He came into the match with rather serious knee injury. And it's pretty soon that you see that he is struggling. And right, he has to get substituted off pretty early. And this is the thing. So in 1966, there wasn't substitutes. So if someone had to come off injured, you have to play a man down. So within the first half hour, Italy's captain, who's limping around the pitch as soon as the match starts, he has to come off because he can't continue. And the speed of the North Koreans, because that's it. This Italian team, this is peak Cavenaccio, guys. This is peak like bad Italy ball, where it's hunkered down, seven, eight guys in defense, hit you on the counter attack, and then do the same thing, but just double down even more and play for 1-0. The Italians have not seen anything like the North Koreans. They're getting ran at, they're getting ran at, they're getting ran at. They're getting worked. And then just before the half, an Italian defender makes a horrible, horrible clearance that heads back into the box and falls to the foot of Pak Du Ilk. And he hits it first time, and there it was in the back of the net. And, in the words of the BBC radio commentator, the North Koreans have taken the league with 5 minutes before the break. What a sensation. You can say that again, and he did. And right as the game progressed, the Italians, even though they carve out a couple pretty decent chances, they just playing a man down. And again, these waves. The one thing that you can say about this match is this the ball. Their ball carriers could not carry the ball because the North Koreans would just take the ball off them. Now, would that end in a successful North Korean attack or anything? No. But the pressing worked. It stymied anything. And the Italians had to like get out of their, comfort zone and actually come and attack. And look, with 10 men, that was easier said than done. And so the match ends 1-0. And the British Foreign Office, they're confused, they're angry, they're sad because this is their worst nightmare. This is the team that they did not want there in the first place and wish wouldn't exist, has, against all odds, progressed out of the group stage. The first, the first non-European, non-South American club to do so. And right throughout the world, this is the predominant sports story the next day, right? In England, journalists vied for hyperbole here, right? In the Daily Express, Arnold Howe wrote, Pak Dun Ik last night detonated one of the great explosions in soccer. He scored the goal that hurled the Italians out of the World Cup, that sent the non-entities of North Korea into the quarterfinals, that sent the land of the morning calm into a Middlesbrough night of frenzy. The Guardian, journalist Neville Nicholas, recorded, everyone had gone along to see a class at Italy's side, but the game turned on its head when Pak Du Ilk scored a great goal. The whole place erupted. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. From then on, we adopted them, Korea, and we still talk about them now. This is big. And in terms of, and again, I'll talk about this specifically in terms of the aftermath of the tournament. This is a huge moment. This is the first time that a non-purely Western team advanced beyond the group stage. And again, it's not just any non-Western team. It's that non-Western team. Ooh, who, by the way, British Foreign Office has been adopted by the city of Middlesbrough as like their new club, their new favorite team. So this is an incredible moment, and one which it has to be said, no one, no one had on their bingo card. The quarterfinals, however, proved to be a little bit more daunting. So the North Koreans are matched up with Portugal, and not just any Portugal, straight up a Subio Portugal. The match is played at Goodison Park in Liverpool. The atmosphere before the match is interesting again because the cult of this North Korean team, and that's a good way to describe it, cult following, has moved beyond Middlesbrough. We're not certain how many people came from Middlesbrough or how many were local Liverpudlians. Although again, in my research, I found that it seemed to be a 50-50 split. But the overwhelming, crowd, right, was on or rooting for the North Koreans, right? This is effectively almost a home match for North Korea. And again, Liverpool working class, there is that little bit of ideological connective tissue. Again, not that we know there probably is a Juche Study Society somewhere on Merseyside. Right, but the crowd is largely pro North Korean. And the match is arguably the best match of the tournament. So within the first minute, Pak Sung Jin uh scores. And North Korea lead Portugal 1-0, right from jump. Uh right. And you know, within the first 42 minutes, the score is 3-0 North Korea. Right. The North Koreans, again, much like they had done with the Italians and much like they had done with the Chileans, unless you were going to be like the Soviets and play frickin', berserker ball against them, the speed of the North Koreans, they end this attacking in waves, they were able to catch the Portuguese by surprise. So much so, and again, going back to, the fans, uh, after the second goal comes in, the crowd is cheering, "We want a third, we want a third." Well, they get a third. But then the Portuguese wake up. After the first 25 minutes, excuse me, 25 minutes, it's 3-0. Portugal wakes up, but really it's not even so much Portugal. It's Asubio. Asubio freaking happens. And he scores 4 goals. Granted, one was a penalty. And the match ends 5-3 to Portugal. So the Portuguese score 5 unanswered goals, and North Korea is out. And the Foreign Office can breathe a sigh of relief. But what the North Koreans did for those couple weeks there in the summer of 1966 is going to loom large. Uh, Very, very large. From a purely footballing standpoint, this is the moment. where the decolonizing world, the world that isn't simply just Europe and South America, has arrived, right? And between what North Korea does in this tournament and what Africa doesn't do by sitting out, this is going to force those changes, those reforms that you see in the next couple tournaments, right? Where the field of non-European, non-South American teams are expanded, right? For North Korea itself and the regime, this is a political windfall. Right. The ability to say that you're the first post-colonial state to get out of the group stage does the North Korean regime's charm campaign in, not just the decolonizing world, but in the world as a whole, a lot of, it brings a lot of street cred. So much so that in 1972, that North Korea is finally admitted into the UN, and 2 years later, they are officially admitted as a full member of the non-aligned movement. And, North Korea's goals of entering the international community is achieved. And so too, the export of their own particular ideological brand of Juche and Kalima. Because, right, a bunch of countries in the non-West, states in sub-Saharan Africa like Benin, Burkina Faso after Thomas Sankara comes to power, Guyana, don't drink the Kool-Aid. Go to North Korea and the North Koreans and ask them, not the Soviets, not the Chinese, not the Cubans. How did you guys modernize? How did you develop? And so North Korean specialists come to these places to, train their armies, to build giant monuments for the, memory and memorialization of independence or the revolution, etc. Uh, Choreographers and dance people to show these regimes, these states, how to do mass parades, mass games, and also two football managers. The Guianan national team. Guyana was weird. Guyana is this weird socialist country in the Western Hemisphere that's English speaking. Right. And there's this period there in the second half of the 70s and the early 80s where, they lean more towards the socialist camp. But in particular, there's this weird relationship between them and North Korea. Uh, Also Jim Jones, but yeah, North Korea too. And right, so the North Koreans send down a bunch of specialists that are working in economics, education, healthcare, etc. But one of the things that they do is that North Korean engineers and construction workers build the National Football Stadium in Georgetown, right? That is North Korean designed and effectively North Korean built. And right, the national team's coaching staff is sent to Pyongyang so that they can learn Juche ball. And so that Juche ball can come to the Western Hemisphere and, come to Guyana. The Guianan football, in a very real sense, the cement, the concrete, the structure is North Korean. So, it's an incredible success for the North Koreans. But at the same time, it's kind of weird what happens to these players. Like the team comes home to North Korea after they go out in the quarters, and they are treated like heroes. Right, uh the players and the manager are awarded collectively the award of People's Athletes of the People, which that's a bizarre name for an award, but you get the point. People's Athletes for the People, etc. But North Korea being what they are and so insular, this notion of, again, Juche, self-reliance. Some of these players in the aftermath of what is this country's greatest football in triumph are effectively, purged. Some of them are arrested and sent to camps, or, forced labor in, mines, right? A former political prisoner, now a journalist in South Korea, remembered seeing one of the players, Park Sun-jin, the guy who scored the opening goal against Portugal, by the way, at the Yadok prison camp sometime in the 1970s. Right? So yeah, some of these guys are purged, and the rationale for purging them is that they have been contaminated, right? They gone to the West and they did the country proud, but because they were in the West, because they were in Middlesbrough, maybe because they had Yorkshire pudding or a couple pints of bitter, you are somehow contaminated. And it's sort of the same thing that happened to a lot of Soviet soldiers during World War II. They came home from liberating Europe from fascism only to be arrested by the NKVD because it was like, you were in Prague for 6 months and therefore you have been contaminated by capitalist ideas and the capitalist way of thinking. Similar thing with a lot of these North Korean players. Uh, Eventually, all of them are rehabilitated, right? And there's an excellent documentary that used to be on YouTube. I don't know if you can still find it, that actually goes to North Korea and talks to the surviving members of that team. Right. But yeah, things after the 66 World Cup, it's a mixed bag, right? They're treated like heroes, but within a couple years, a lot of them are arrested or purged. The manager, he is not arrested, but he's effectively blackballed and doesn't get work in the North Korean football system at all, for about a decade. So the 1966, the events of 1966 for North Korea is a boon. It's a way to sell their project, and indeed they do sell their project. However, the participants, the people that actually made this happen, they are, their reception goes from heroes to, in many cases, outcasts and dangerous criminals, dangerous elements. So that's it for this episode. I don't really have anything more to say. This sort of micro series on 66 was fun, especially this one because a lot of the quotes that I had, again, these are things that I uncovered in my own researches. So, this is a topic that's sort of near to my heart, this notion of football diplomacy, right? And unfortunately, I wasn't, despite dirty rumors. I don't have connections in North Korea, so I wasn't able to do research in North Korea, nor do I speak or read Korean. Right. But, this was a lot of fun, and I can't wait for the next episode, which it may be a solo op. I might have a guest. It's going to be France and Algeria, right, where we look at the FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, the National Liberation Front's own football team, and right, the continued tensions within not just Algeria, but particularly France itself. Over the question of its former colonial past and how that plays into the beautiful game that we all love. So, my hope is to get that out to you guys, geez, sometime in June. Right. My summer one semester is starting next week, but it's only 2 days a week, so I should be pumping these out at a half decent clip during the summer. So expect that in the next couple weeks. And right, I'm still waiting to hear from Cam about when we can give you the next episode of Celtic and Scouse, but that should be coming relatively soon. And right, I'm sure we're gonna have a end of the season recap episode in the works. So this is Professor Kowal, this is Professor Matt. I almost said Professor Kowalski. What am I talking about? I need more caffeine. This is Professor Matt, and this is the Too Many Guys Soccer Show history. As always, do well, avoid evil.